Information today, as you all know, has acquired a very special status, significance and importance in the entire gamut of national development. We have with us this afternoon Mrs. Professor Brown, who has been an eminent professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, to discuss the important aspect of study which we have been talked about, quite widely discussed also, namely the National Information Policy. Mrs. Brown, National Information Policy appears to be a rather non-achievable target because it appears to be a number of stakeholders involved in this. What exactly do you mean by National Information Policy? Could you give us some idea of what constitutes the entire range and dimensions of National Information Policy?
Well, that's a very difficult question because, as you said, Dr. Rajan, there are many stakeholder groups, and depending on which group is defining or speaking about National Information Policy, you have quite a different concept of what is involved. I notice in your newspapers, since I've come to Delhi, very like our own newspapers in Australia at the moment, there's constant reference to information and communication policy. And in that case, in the media and among politicians, very often, in fact, probably primarily what they're talking about is information technology. They're talking about communication, media, they're talking about television licensing, they're talking about satellites, they're talking about computing industry and so on. So information policy to those groups is about the technical side, the carrying, as so to speak. Of course, then when you talk with people in the library information profession who are more concerned with the content, the messages and the meaning of information, when they talk about National Information Policy, and certainly this is my concept too, they're talking about policies and guidelines and rationale for the provision of information and strategies for getting information to people who are going to use it in situations which contribute to national development and to social development and so on, and indeed even to private enterprise and the development of that aspect of society. So for me, true, as it were, National Information Policy covers information transfer processes, and it deals with those agencies and which are in turn involved in the provision of information to users, people who will actually take that information and will do something with it.
Actually, while so many stakeholders are involved, is it possible for us to evolve a national policy? What could be the need that we can talk about when we want to introduce an information policy for the national efforts? What do you think is the need?
Well, it's very difficult to say how we should go about this. In Australia, and I think in India also, I've been doing some background reading on developments here, and I've read of your various approaches, and of course UNESCO has done a lot of writing in this field. There's been a lot of thinking about what it should be, and there have been these grand plans, if you like, developed, whereby everything is coherent and integrated and logical, and there is a sense of unity about developing an approach to providing information. And I've been involved in Australia in developing some such plans. but they haven't been very successful. And I think conceptually they're very satisfactory. I mean, they're right. They talk about information transfer, and a lot of issues and policies and so on can flow very, very logically from that. But I think that we haven't quite understood the realities of policy making. I think that in our field we've tended to be maybe a bit too idealistic, and we haven't managed somehow to speak the stakeholders' language. We haven't managed to knit our perspective in with that bigger perspective, which is somehow in today's world with the dominance of technology seems more glamorous. You know, the technology, the satellites, the telecommunications. And so I think that we are going to have to do a great deal more.
It appears to me actually the need arises on account of the fact that we are having too many types of information institutions. There has not been particular aspect of coordination amongst them, and as a result things are pulling in different directions. The need has arisen largely on the fact that we need to organize ourselves coherently, so much so the fact of information services gets a priority. And although we are concerned with contents much more than the media through which we communicate and disseminate, even so there is a necessity for ourselves to group and organize ourselves in such a fashion that we are able to communicate with those who are going to disseminate the information and establish a very particular need for this. I think this need appears to be even more important when we look at the whole thing. What do you think about it?
I think that's very sound reasoning to my way of thinking, but I think that there are difficulties in actually achieving that. I mean, first of all, achieving a unity, if you like, and a single purpose among information agencies. That can be achieved, I believe, because I think the values and the general approach that the library information profession takes has some commonality. But I think with the modern developments internationally, where we're seeing a breakdown, if you like, and this is certainly happening in Australia, and I think it's beginning to shift here too. We're seeing a breakdown of the notion that government can provide plans, that government can coordinate, or even that government should coordinate. And we're seeing in Europe, for example, the new information policies there are very, very clear that the government will step out of the arena of policy and basically will leave it to the private sector. So the private sector will drive the policy, if you like, and the role of government and the role of coordinating agencies will not be to provide the plan or the coordination, but will be, in effect, to make the climate right for the private sector. Now
actually, when you look at the components, the issues involved in making a policy, the institutional structure that has been built up over the years, and also the changing dimensions of information and information services, and a great deal of databases coming electronically, transferred information, and so on and so forth. A wide variety and range of activities are taking place. Now, in this context of trying to develop a policy towards providing information, if I may say so, to all those who need, what are the components that we can take together? For instance, one component is the consumer, who is all the time needing information. It is a wide variety of consumers that we have. The research community is one. The ordinary person is having to deal with information in a variety of ways. For instance, if he is planning a program of tour. In this way, information has been a very essential necessity for a wide variety of group of people, although information has been deemed as important only to the academics and also to the other educational systems and so on and so forth. This has been the general understanding, conventional role of information, but it has widened very much in the last several decades. Now, in this set of circumstances, what do you think are the components? For instance, let me spell out one. The consumers are one. The institutional structure is the second. The media is third, which is included, which is intertwined with technology, and the information products and services are the other thing. And also the marketing of all these things has become a very important study these days. Now, when you look at these things, such a number of varieties of components involved, a policy which is particularly oriented towards information, library information systems, as you very rightly said, we have got to interact with those who are working with this in one way or the other. Not that we have established a very excellent rapport with them. Even so, we have got to deal with them in a way that they understand our problems and we understand their problems. Now, in this set of circumstances, what do you think that these components that I have enumerated will have any meaning?
Well, I suppose I would take a fairly macro view on that. I mean, I think that information policy, whatever it is, whether it's a policy to allow the private sector its head to drive the direction, or whether it's a policy of planning from a central point at state level or a regional level, I think one way or the other, you must cover in that policy, you must cover the major components. You must cover the telecommunications industry, the computing industry, both hardware and software, and then finally you must cover those industries in the policy which deal with the content. Now, of course, library and information services are not the only places where content is dealt with. Content, of course, comes up in many contexts. But what I think we haven't done yet in the profession, which to me is an essential step, is we've not yet carved out or identified and communicated what it is that we do with information that's different from the next person. And to me, the thing that we do that's different is what we call the value-added services. We are the specialists in identifying the right information for the user. We're the specialists in analyzing it, interpreting it, in repackaging it, in synthesizing it, and actually dealing with that substance and making evaluative activities which give that extra value. And so when we talk about our role in the information policy or in the information business, I think we have to do a lot more within the information transfer model, if you like, the fact that it's about information transfer.
Yeah, when you talk of the model, I saw when we were discussing this morning that you had developed a model.
Yes.
Now, I would like you to interact in the sense that the internet is introducing a new dimension again, providing information in a much faster way, and where information access has been a great deal of difficulty. Now, in the context of internet coming into the picture and providing a variety of information, right from mass communication to the highly specialized information, and the roles of libraries and information centers constantly reacting and changing their own dimensions and so on. Now, what would be the nature of the policy that we can think of?
The information policy that will integrate libraries and internet. Well, to me, I mean, internet, of course, is a wonderful, absolutely wonderful facility. Before I came to India, I was able to go onto the internet to read, what was happening in India, to see what kind of policy was being developed. And so I was able to get access to information that simply wasn't available in the printed form. But if we think more flexibly, I mean, when we talk about library and information services, I think that I suppose our mindset is it's about documents, it's about physical entities. But if we think of what technology has opened up for us in the way of resources, when we think of the wonderful electronic sources that are now available both on CD-ROM but on the internet, we need to sort of broaden our concept of what information sources are and include the internet. Now, the internet in that context, our policy won't be to try and control the internet or to put things on the internet, be the only people to put things on the internet, but in the services we provide and in our approaches, we must acknowledge its existence.
This takes us to the fact that information today appears to be a global phenomenon. It's not a national, particularly oriented towards a particular national. The whole issue is acquiring a dimension of global value. Now, in this context, what could be the national policy? Because vis-a-vis such attempts at internet, and internet they are claiming a lot about its possibility and its dimension extending beyond its present scope even. And libraries are changing very widely. There has been a recent publication on the impact of internet on public libraries, academic libraries and special libraries. Now this new phenomenon that is coming up is supposed to change totally the information process altogether in the next century. Now in this I would like you to focus attention on what exactly is being thought in Australia
about
with reference to its global feature as well as national interest and the local interest. It should glide. National interests will have to be properly linked with the local interests, and these interests will have to be taken care of at the global level.
Well, perhaps I could just make a comment about Australia to introduce my answer to that. Australia is a very young country. It's just 200 years old, which in your terms it's an infant. But in the last 10 years, and it in its history had very strong ties back to Europe and to the United Kingdom in particular. In the last 10 years, there has been a very strong and very determined effort among Australians at all levels of society, politically and socially, to carve out the really distinctive features of Australia and to be very careful that in this globalization process we do not lose what is distinctly Australian. Now, because we're a small population, we're 18 million in a country the size of North America, basically. We have not got huge markets for information. We have not got the sort of facilities that say like North America would have, and so we were very dependent on overseas sources of information, very dependent on that global perspective, tied into dialogue, for example, as our major source. But in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a real concern that we must not become homogenized with the rest of the world.
Well, in this context, I would like to point out one thing. Actually, the information support facilities, most of the developing countries, possibly to a certain extent Australia too, have got to depend heavily on foreign sources, as you rightly mentioned. Now, what is the extent of indigenous efforts to collect and organize their own information, whether it be primary, secondary or tertiary, whatever, and then how do we organize ourselves in such a fashion that we guess the external sources feeding our internal requirements, and then at the same time consolidating our own internal resources, and dovetail these two in such a fashion that we are able to evolve a national policy which is directly oriented towards our own interests. How do you look at these things?
Well, it's an interesting point you make, because exactly that issue is being debated in Australia at the moment. I'm a member of the Council of the National Library of Australia, which has a mandate to be a coordinating agency for policy development for library and information services throughout Australia. And the National Library of Australia is not a very old library, as you can imagine, given our history. But it set out, I think, originally with the idea that it would be one of the great libraries in the sense that it would collect every discipline, it would collect every subject, it would collect from all over the world. But as history has, and particularly the last 10 years, and the pace of publication and the growth of enormous volume in the output, the scholarly output, at the National Library, it was realized that it was a bit of a pipe dream, a bit of a dream to think you could have a library, a comprehensive library of the world. And after much debate and soul searching, the library redid its mission and has now got as its number one priority the preservation of Australian material, the collecting of Australian related material, and the sort of strengthening, if you like, of the national identity and heritage. And so the collecting and the policies are to that end, which is not to say we've cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. We have a very strong emphasis on the Asian Pacific region, quite a deal of policy development linking us strongly, which is an echo of a government initiative.
Mrs. Brown, actually, as you very rightly said, the preservation and the national policy towards preserving our own national traditions and traits and so on. Now there are others who are also interested in these kind of things. For instance, the Copyright Act, in which the person who is involved in creating something, an intellectual property organization, as you perhaps well know, and there are other efforts. So much so, the interest of preserving and also disseminating, and the way in which censorship is being thought of, accessibility to material, availability to material, all this constitute a very complex set of things in which the library and information center's involvement is at a particular level. And at the higher level, we have, at other levels, I won't call it higher level, at other levels also we have, quite as you rightly said, telecommunication or computer industry, and then the whole product and services industry in information, and a number of things are there. So I feel the whole question of national information policy appears to me, of course, to be a concept than a thing that can be achieved in reality. Do you think so?
Well, but I don't think that I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the concept. I agree with you. I don't see that we will ever have these beautifully written documents which will maintain us through a period of 10 years or something like that. I think that idea of the grand plan is past, but the concept of national information policy, and I think especially for me, our responsibility in the library and information studies area is to look after and to focus on the user side, in those issues of intellectual property, in those issues of copyright. Industry drives the agenda. It wants its money for what has happened. The authors want their money, the publishers want their money, and I think our contribution, apart from the value-added side, must be to protect the right of individuals to information and to ensure that their rights are not overlooked in the process of making policy.
In summing up, my dear friends, 4 points stand out during our discussion. Firstly, we are concerned with, as library information professionals, we are concerned with contents, but we have got to cope up with the media through which we communicate and disseminate. These two have to be properly blended in order to see that we get the right result. That is number point 1. Secondly, information, we have been largely confined to the printed, documented information, but we today see that information can be much wider than the printed word. It goes much beyond the printed word, and multimedia has integrated the print, the visual as well as the audio, and then it provides us a great scope for accessing information in whatever manner we like. So the second point is the print versus non-print. The third point is we had discussed in our talks today that it is not merely national, there is a global aspect of it also. Now, where do we have a mark of division, global versus internal? Internal information, that means indigenously developed information, and all the rest of the things that are necessary for any national developmental activities. And so that the third point is with reference to national and global. The fourth point is the infrastructure that we need to build up. The infrastructure has its own components, its own components in the sense the user, the institutional mechanism, the technology which provides for a number of variety of services and products, and the management aspects. All these things constitute the infrastructure, which is the mechanism through which information can be supplied. Now, these 4 points are the ones that have come out of this discussion. What do you think this kind of approach?
Well, I think that's a very fair summing up of our discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.